The gunshot cracked the afternoon stillness like lightning splitting an oak, and Ruby Zimmerman knew in that moment her life in Cottonwood Springs would never be the same again. Blood pooled beneath the body of Frank Holloway, the town's most feared businessman, while she stood frozen, the smoking revolver still warm in her trembling hand. It wasn't murder she'd defended herself when he'd forced his way into her modest dress shop after hours, but in 1878 Wyoming territory. A woman's word against a powerful man's legacy rarely counted for much. "Drop the gun, Miss Zimmerman," Sheriff Daniels ordered, appearing in the doorway with his deputy. His eyes darted from Ruby to Frank's body, judgment already hardening his features. "You've got a heap of explaining to do." Ruby's reputation had been spotless until that fateful evening in May. The daughter of German immigrants, she'd worked tirelessly to establish her dressmaking business after her parents died of influenza 3 years prior. At 26, she'd earned respect for her skilled needlework and business acumen, operating the only women's clothing shop between Cheyenne and Laramie. She lived modestly in rooms above her shop, attended church regularly, and kept to herself until Frank Holloway decided he wanted more than the custom suits she'd been making for him. By nightfall, Ruby found herself locked in the town jail, her protests about self-defense falling on deaf ears. Frank Holloway owned half the businesses in town, including the bank that held mortgages on most properties. His brother-in-law was the mayor. The narrative forming against her spread through town like wildfire that she'd been secretly involved with Frank, had tried to extort money from him, then killed him in a fit of rage when he refused. "You'll hang for this," Deputy Wilson sneered through the bars. Frank was a pillar of this community. Ruby wrapped her arms around herself, her calico dress stained with blood. "He attacked me. I had no choice." "That ain't how his widow tells it," the deputy spat. "Says you've been making eyes at him for months." 3 days later, the town newspaper printed the story that sealed Ruby's fate. "Dressmaker murders respected businessman in lover's quarrel." The article detailed fabricated accounts of a sordid affair, claiming Ruby had entrapped Frank with her foreign wiles and killed him when he attempted to end their relationship. Mrs. Holloway, grief-stricken and vengeful, had provided most of the details. "My name is mud in this town now," Ruby whispered to herself as she read the paper the sheriff had mockingly tossed into her cell. Tears blurred her vision. No one would believe her now. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week. Ruby had no money for a lawyer, and the court-appointed defender barely acknowledged her explanation before advising her to plead for mercy. "A woman in your position shouldn't expect much," he'd said dismissively. The afternoon before the hearing, Ruby sat on the hard bench in her cell, staring at the dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight from the small barred window. The sound of arguing voices drifted from the sheriff's office, one familiar, one not. "You can't just keep her locked up without proper evidence," the unfamiliar voice insisted. Deep and steady, it carried authority without aggression. "This ain't your jurisdiction, Thompson," Sheriff Daniels responded. "You're just passing through. Best mind your own business." "I'm making it my business," the stranger replied. "I knew Frank Holloway in Cheyenne. He wasn't the saint folks are making him out to be." Ruby moved to the bars, straining to hear better. The conversation continued for several more minutes before heavy boots approached her cell. Sheriff Daniels appeared with a tall, broad-shouldered man behind him. "You've got a visitor, Zimmerman," the sheriff said grudgingly, unlocking the cell door. 10 minutes. I'll be watching." The stranger stepped into the cell as the sheriff retreated to his desk, still visible through the open doorway. Close up, Ruby could see the man was in his early 30s, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. His clothes were trail-worn but clean denims, a chambray shirt, and a dust-covered Stetson he now held respectfully in his hands. "Miss Zimmerman," he said quietly, "my name's Reid Thompson. I'm a cattle buyer from Montana Territory, but I used to work with the Territorial Marshal's office. I heard what happened, and I don't believe the story they're spinning." Ruby studied him cautiously. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "I knew Holloway," Reid replied, his expression darkening. "Had dealings with him in Cheyenne 3 years back. He tried to cheat a widow out of her land. I stopped him, and he didn't take kindly to it." He paused. "When I heard what supposedly happened here, it didn't sit right. Frank had a history of forcing himself on women, but his money always kept him out of trouble." Hope flickered within Ruby for the first time in days. "No one will believe me over his wife and the mayor." "Maybe not yet," Reid agreed. "But I've sent a telegram to some former colleagues who might have information on Frank's past misdeeds. In the meantime, I've paid your bail." Ruby's eyes widened in disbelief. "You what?" "The judge set it at $500. Reid shrugged. "I had a good season. Besides, I owe it to another woman Holloway hurt who never got justice." He didn't elaborate further. "You'll still need to stay in town for the trial, but at least you won't be in this cell." Sheriff Daniels appeared at the doorway, clearly displeased. "Time's up, Thompson. Since you insist on this foolishness, I've got papers for you to sign." As the sheriff led Reid away, Ruby remained frozen in place, unable to comprehend this unexpected intervention. 20 minutes later, she walked out of the jailhouse, blinking in the bright sunlight. Reid waited with her satchel of belongings the sheriff had confiscated. "You can't go back to your shop," he explained. "There's too much anger in town right now. I've arranged a room at the widow Carson's boarding house on the edge of town. She doesn't hold with gossip." Ruby felt tears threatening. "Why are you really doing this?" Reid's expression softened. "Because I believe in justice, Miss Zimmerman. And because no one stood up when another woman's reputation was destroyed by Frank Holloway's lies." He offered his arm. "Shall we go? People are staring." Indeed they were. As Reid escorted Ruby down the main street, townspeople stopped to gawk and whisper. Some women pulled their children closer as if Ruby carried disease. A few men removed their hats in mock salute, snickering. Ruby felt each stare like a physical blow. "Hold your head high," Reid murmured. "Don't give them the satisfaction." Widow Carson's boarding house sat on 3 acres at the eastern edge of town, a 2-story white clapboard structure with green shutters and a wide front porch. The widow herself, a stout woman with silver hair and shrewd eyes, greeted them at the door. "Brought me trouble, I see," she remarked to Reid, but her tone held no malice. "Brought you an innocent woman who needs shelter," Reid corrected respectfully. Mrs. Carson studied Ruby. "I don't abide liars or loose women in my house." Ruby met her gaze directly. "I am neither, madam." After a long moment, the older woman nodded. "Second floor, East Room, meals at 7, noon, and 6. No gentlemen callers upstairs." She shot a pointed look at Reid. "I'll be staying at the livery," he assured her, "but I'll call tomorrow to discuss our strategy for the trial." That night, alone in the clean, sparse room, Ruby wept silently into her pillow. Her life's work was likely ruined. Her reputation, the only thing a single woman truly owned, was destroyed. She had escaped the gallows for now, but even if she weren't convicted, what future remained for her in Cottonwood Springs? True to his word, Reid arrived the next morning. Mrs. Carson grudgingly allowed them use of her parlor, though she left the door conspicuously open and busied herself dusting nearby. "The circuit judge arrives next week," Reid explained. "Until then, we need to build your defense. Tell me everything that happened with Holloway, every detail." Ruby hesitated, conscious of Mrs. Carson's presence. "Maybe we should walk," Reid suggested, noting her discomfort. They strolled along the property's edge, far enough from the house for privacy but still within propriety's bounds. There, Ruby related the full account of Frank Holloway's increasingly inappropriate behavior over the months, culminating in his assault the night she shot him. He'd been ordering suits, always insisting on extra fittings, standing too close. "I told him I'd need my assistant present for future appointments, and that angered him," she explained. "The night it happened, he came in after closing. He'd been drinking. Said if I wouldn't give him what he wanted willingly, he'd take it." Reid's jaw tightened. "And the gun, my father's. I keep it under the counter since I'm often alone in the shop. When Frank pushed me against the wall, I managed to reach it." Her voice faltered. "I only meant to frighten him, but he lunged at me." Reid nodded grimly. "You acted in self-defense. But we need witnesses to his character, evidence of similar behavior." "His wife has this town convinced I was pursuing him," Ruby said bitterly. "No one will speak against the Holloways." "Someone will," Reid assured her. "My telegram was to a former colleague who now works for the Pinkerton agency. If Frank harassed other women in Cheyenne or elsewhere, we'll find them." Over the next few days, a tentative partnership formed between Ruby and Reid, while she remained largely confined to Mrs. Carson's property to avoid town hostility. Reid divided his time between investigating locally and meeting with the court-appointed defender, convincing him to actually prepare a case rather than simply urging Ruby to plead guilty. Mrs. Carson, initially aloof, gradually warmed to Ruby. One evening, as they shelled peas on the back porch, she offered her first personal comment. "That Thompson fellow rides a long way each day just to help you." Ruby concentrated on the task at hand. "He believes in justice." "Men like that are rare," Mrs. Carson observed. "My Harold was one. Married me despite my father's bankruptcy scandal. Said my name was mud, but he'd clean it up proper." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. 27 good years we had." Understanding dawned on Ruby. "That's why you took me in." Mrs. Carson simply nodded and continued shelling peas. 4 days before the trial, Reid returned from Cheyenne with triumph in his eyes and a smartly dressed woman beside him. He introduced her as Margaret Wilcox, a former seamstress who'd worked in Cheyenne when Frank Holloway lived there. "Miss Wilcox has agreed to testify," Reid explained once they were seated in Mrs. Carson's parlor. "She had an experience with Frank similar to yours." Margaret, a woman in her 30s with a resolute expression, nodded. "He attacked me in my shop 3 years ago. When I threatened to report him, he spread rumors that I'd been soliciting gentlemen's attentions. I lost my business, my reputation." Her hands trembled slightly. "I couldn't prove anything against him. His friends all swore he was elsewhere that night. I had to leave Cheyenne." "And there are others," Reid added. 2 have provided sworn affidavits about similar encounters. The Pinkerton man is bringing them for the trial." For the first time, Ruby felt real hope. "Will it be enough?" "It should create reasonable doubt," Reid said. "But we're still facing a town that practically worshipped Frank Holloway. His widow is well connected and determined to see you punished." The day before the trial, Reid arrived with another visitor, a distinguished older man with silver hair and shrewd eyes. "Miss Zimmerman, this is Judge Morris," Reid introduced them. "He's an old friend of my father's from back east. He happened to be in Laramie when I sent word about your case." Judge Morris bowed slightly. "Mr. Thompson has explained your situation, Miss Zimmerman. While I cannot directly intervene in another judge's court, I can certainly observe the proceedings and ensure proper judicial conduct is maintained." Ruby's gratitude toward Reid deepened. He had gone to extraordinary lengths for her, a woman he barely knew. That evening, after the judge departed for the hotel in town, Ruby found herself alone with Reid on Mrs. Carson's front porch. The setting sun painted the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Why are you really doing all this?" she asked softly. "The truth this time." Reid was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Frank Holloway ruined my sister's life," he finally said. "She worked as a schoolteacher in Cheyenne while I was riding with the marshals. He forced himself on her, then spread stories that she'd been entertaining men for money." His voice tightened. "By the time I returned, she couldn't bear the shame, took her own life." Ruby's hand covered her mouth. "Reid, I'm so sorry. I tried to bring charges against him afterward, but his money bought all the right people. He left town soon after, and I lost track of him until I heard about what happened here." He turned to her, his eyes intense. "When I saw your name in that newspaper, accused of the same kind of lies he told about my sister, I knew I had to help. I couldn't save Rebecca, but maybe I could save you." Without thinking, Ruby reached for his hand. "You already have, in more ways than you know." The morning of the trial dawned clear and cool. Ruby wore her finest dress, navy blue wool with white collar and cuffs, modest but dignified. Reid escorted her to the courthouse, Judge Morris walking on her other side. The street was lined with townspeople, some jeering, others merely curious. Ruby held her head high, drawing strength from Reid's steady presence. The courthouse was packed. Mrs. Holloway sat in the front row, dressed in elaborate black mourning clothes, a handkerchief clutched dramatically in her gloved hand. The mayor and other town officials filled the seats behind her. On Ruby's side sat Mrs. Carson, Margaret Wilcox, and a few other women who had gradually shown support as Reid's investigations revealed Frank's true character. The trial proceeded with the prosecution presenting their version of events, painting Ruby as a calculating seductress who murdered Frank when he rejected her advances. Mrs. Holloway testified tearfully about finding love letters from Ruby in her husband's desk. The sheriff described finding Ruby standing over Frank with the gun. When Ruby's turn came, she told the simple truth about Frank's escalating harassment, his assault that night, her act of desperate self-defense. Margaret testified next, describing her similar experience in Cheyenne. The Pinkerton agent presented affidavits from two other women with corresponding accounts of Frank's predatory behavior. The crowning moment came when Reid's lawyer friend, who had joined them the previous evening, presented evidence that the love letters Mrs. Holloway claimed to have found were written on paper that hadn't been manufactured until 3 months after Frank's death. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. After 4 hours of testimony, the judge, initially hostile but increasingly attentive as evidence mounted, instructed the jury. They deliberated for less than an hour. "Not guilty," the foreman announced, on grounds of self-defense. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Mrs. Holloway shrieked accusations while Ruby stood in stunned disbelief. Reid's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "It's over," he murmured. But they both knew it wasn't, not really. Though legally exonerated, Ruby's reputation remained tarnished. As they left the courthouse, she overheard whispers. "Got away with murder, and still a fallen woman." Back at Mrs. Carson's house that evening, Ruby faced the reality of her situation. "I can't stay in Cottonwood Springs," she told Reid as they sat on the porch swing. "Even with the verdict, people will always see me as the woman who killed Frank Holloway." Reid nodded slowly. "I know. I've been thinking about that." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket. "I have something to ask you, Ruby, but I want you to know you're free to refuse." He withdrew a small, worn velvet box and opened it to reveal a simple gold band with a small pearl. "This was my mother's. I've carried it for years, waiting for the right woman." His eyes, earnest and vulnerable, met hers. "I know we've only known each other a short time, but I've seen your courage, your integrity, your strength. I'm returning to my ranch in Montana next week. I'd be honored if you'd come with me as my wife." Ruby stared at him, speechless. "Reid, you don't need to do this. You've already done so much." "I'm not offering marriage out of obligation," he said firmly. "These past weeks, watching you face this town's cruelty with dignity, getting to know the woman behind the accusations, I've fallen in love with you, Ruby Zimmerman. I believe we could build a good life together." Tears filled her eyes. "My name is still mud in these parts. People will talk." Reid smiled gently. "Let them. In Montana, you'll be Mrs. Reid Thompson, a name as clean and bright as you deserve." He took her hand. "I can't promise wealth or an easy life, but I can promise respect, partnership, and my whole heart." Ruby studied his face, the kindness in his eyes, the strength in his features, the absolute sincerity of his expression. In the few weeks she'd known him, he'd shown more character than most men she'd known her entire life. And somewhere along the way, amid the fear and turmoil, she'd fallen in love with him too. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Reid Thompson." They were married 3 days later in Mrs. Carson's parlor. Judge Morris performed the ceremony, with Margaret Wilcox and the widow herself serving as witnesses. Ruby wore a dress of pale blue silk, one she'd made herself years ago, but never found occasion to wear. "By the power vested in me," Judge Morris pronounced with a smile, "I now declare you husband and wife." As Reid slipped his mother's ring onto her finger, Ruby felt the weight of the past weeks lifting. Her name had been dragged through mud, but this good man had helped clean it and offered her his own in its place. 2 days later, they departed Cottonwood Springs. Mrs. Holloway and her allies had already begun spreading new rumors about the shotgun marriage, claiming Ruby must be carrying Reid's child. But their words held no power over Ruby now. As their wagon rolled out of town, Ruby glanced back at the place that had been her home for years. Her dress shop would be sold, her belongings packed and forwarded. It wasn't the future she'd planned, but perhaps it was the one she was meant to have. "Ready for Montana?" Reid asked, his hand warm over hers. Ruby turned away from Cottonwood Springs and faced forward. "Ready for our future," she replied. The journey to Reid's ranch in the Montana Territory took nearly 2 weeks. They traveled through Wyoming's high plains and into Montana's rolling grasslands, stopping at settlements along the way. Each night, they grew closer, learning each other's histories, dreams, and hearts. By the time they reached the Thompson Ranch, a modest but well-maintained property nestled in a valley with mountains rising in the distance, Ruby felt as though she'd known Reid all her life. The ranch hands welcomed them with genuine warmth, having heard from Reid's letters about the woman who'd captured their boss's heart. The ranch house was simple but comfortable, with large windows overlooking the valley and a wide front porch where they would spend many evenings watching the sunset. In the years that followed, Ruby built a new life far from the gossip and accusations of Cottonwood Springs. She turned one room of the ranch house into a sewing workshop, eventually building a clientele among the women in the nearby town. When their first child was born, a daughter they named Rebecca, after Reid's sister, the joy in Reid's eyes confirmed what Ruby had long since realized. Sometimes life's darkest moments lead to its greatest blessings. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Reid presented Ruby with a gift, the deed to a small building in town where she could open a proper dress shop. "You never have to hide who you are again," he told her, his love evident in every word. "Your name is respected throughout the county now, Mrs. Thompson." Ruby smiled, touching the pearl ring that had never left her finger. "I have a better name now," she said softly, "but I wouldn't have it if you hadn't believed in the one I had before." As the sun set over their Montana home, Ruby thought of that terrible day in her shop in Cottonwood Springs, how one moment had nearly destroyed her, and how a stranger's belief in justice had saved not just her life, but her heart. Her name had indeed been dragged through mud, but Reid had cleaned it with more than just the ring on her hand. He had cleaned it with his unwavering faith in her innocence, his determination to see justice done, and most of all, with a love that saw beyond rumors to the truth of who she really was.